Hello, it's Silver. This is SilverSeraphym Refrain Chord, quite the name. This game is an SRPG that's actually related to another game by the name of SilverSeraphym Advent Dark Force. Now, I've never actually played that game. To be honest, I would like to. It does look like something that would be very much up my alley, but I don't currently own it. And it does look like more of a traditional JRPG kind of setup, whereas this is, as you can see, very much a tactics RPG, and it's kind of in a weird place. I said it's related to the other game because it's not really a sequel to that game, but it's also not a retelling exactly either necessarily. It's kind of strange. Basically, it does have new story elements. It's got new characters first off, but it's also got the returning characters from that game, but it reintroduces some of them as if it's their first time meeting, and some of the plot points are different. But it also doesn't reintroduce a lot of the base characters and how they got together. You're just sort of expected to already know that, so the sort of earlier character development of how this group actually met and all that stuff, that doesn't happen in this game. So it's in this weird halfway point where it kind of expects you to remember the previous game, but it's also not really stepping off of it as a sequel or anything, and is kind of retelling other parts of the story. This game is pretty much half and half in between an SRPG battle system and a sort of visual novel presentation kind of idea, because there is no exploration or anything in this game. You don't walk around on a world map or walk around in towns or anything like that. All of your navigation is done on a world map sort of menu. You don't actually walk from place to place. This means that, like I said, the game is pretty much split 50-50 between like your party cutscenes and dialogue moments and all that stuff, and then the actual battles themselves. Story-wise, this is one of those games that goes for the kind of JRPG parody kind of idea, where a lot of it is sort of self-aware that it's a video game and is self-aware of a lot of the common tropes that happen in JRPGs and kind of lampshades them in different ways. But I tend to find that it's kind of hard for me to comment on like the humor of a game like this, right? Because it's so subjective. Some people are gonna really get a kick out of it, some people it's just not gonna land for them at all. For me personally, I've actually found that a surprising number of the jokes have actually been kind of funny. Normally I don't tend to find like parody RPGs all that funny most of the time. It's just, I don't know, it's a problem that I have, I guess. I don't tend to enjoy that style of writing as much as a more serious tone most of the time, but I will say that this game can actually be genuinely quite funny at times. I think part of that is because the writing is, although very juvenile at times, also kind of good in unexpected ways. Like, mostly it's when the characters sort of break character and actually speak in ways they don't normally that kind of get me, because it's unexpected, right? And that's sort of the best part of a parody RPG, is when the unexpected jokes happen, when things that aren't necessarily set up end up being funny in a way that you didn't actually expect. This game actually does that pretty well. But of course it is also interspersed with loads and loads of like shonen anime humor. So if you're familiar with that sort of thing, then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. This has lots of that. So yeah, your mileage may vary in terms of whether or not the jokes will land for you and whether or not you think this particular style of like humorous writing is actually funny for you personally. But for me, I have to admit that I actually enjoyed it more than I thought I would story-wise, because the characters are actually kind of funny at times. The voice acting is really good, which I think really is what helps sell it a lot. The voice acting is in Japanese only, by the way. It's not, there is no English localization for the voices. Of course, everything else in the game is in English, obviously all the menus and the subtitles and everything, but the voices themselves are in Japanese, and I think it actually kind of helps. It helps with the like more absurd moments actually land better, in my opinion. I think that oftentimes the sort of silliness of like Japanese voice acting in terms of like absurdist character moments and weird humor, that sort of stuff, tends to work better for me, and I think maybe that's why I found some of this game to actually be kind of funny. But otherwise, the story is, it's a story you've heard before many times, but it does at least have some beats that I didn't necessarily expect. It is a story very much about a large corporation that is, surprise, evil, and they are going through the world, you know, dominating it by making all sorts of products to increase their shares and becoming like the sort of major manufacturer of everything, thus taking over most of the world. But in secret, they are doing some really inhumane experiments and creating these sort of artificial warriors, mostly from children. So it does have a very dark undertone to it in terms of the overall story that kind of intersperses the humor with like some really dark stuff. And that's, I think, another reason why some of the humor actually works better, because it's not constant humor all the time, right? But yeah, it's definitely a story that you've heard before, especially if you're familiar with like JRPGs and things, but I will say the one thing that surprised me was that a lot of the main sort of big bad characters, the big bad guys that hound you throughout your experience and you have multiple boss fights with and stuff, a lot of them actually find what the company is doing to be pretty abhorrent, and eventually it gets too much for them and they basically defect. And that's kind of unusual in JRPGs for the sort of evil guys to actually have some self-awareness enough to say, alright, that's a little too far, you need to tone it down a little bit, and actually decide to sort of go off on their own. Mechanics-wise, it is a pretty fully featured SRPG. It's got a lot of the stuff that you would expect. You are, of course, in these tile-based, turn-based battles on pretty sizable battlefields, oftentimes with lots of elevation differences and things, and of course there are different skills that can or cannot hit at certain elevations and all that sort of expected stuff. You've also got some destructible elements, which is interesting. You'll sometimes find like crates and stuff that can be used to jump up to higher locations, but you can actually attack the crates and destroy them and prevent people from using them unless they have a very high jump stat, and some other things that can help the battlefields feel a little bit more dynamic, but for the most part they are big cubes, right? They're just a big square that you do battle in, and they tend to be relatively sizable in terms of the number of units on screen at any given time, but you do only have 6 party members that you can field at once. You will gain more than 6 pretty quickly, but you can choose 6 at a time. Every character has these entities called fairies that they're equipped with that give them powers. They kind of work like materia almost, actually. So every character has one main fairy, which is actually their sort of story companion, and they also have a sub-fairy, which is something that you can find and equip yourself. And a fairy will have all sorts of different things that you can get for them. You gain these skill points by just doing actions in battle in general, from attacking, using skills, using spells, using items, all that stuff gets you experience and skill points. And you can spend these skill points for each fairy individually, by the way. It's not like a single pool that you split in between characters. It's individual to each person that's in battle, which is handy because it allows you to grow people faster that way. But you'll be able to use these skill points on things like new weapon skills for the weapon types that character has, as well as new spells to unlock, of course, and some other things like stat increases. They're just passive increases to various stats, which tend to add up pretty quickly, so they're valuable to get. There's also a lot of passive effects and other sort of benefits like that that allow you to equip other passives like counterattacks and boosts during low health and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot to each fairy, and the fact that you can equip the sub-fairies in whatever order you want, you can just equip all of the ones that you've currently found on any one. There isn't any sort of limitation. This means that you have quite a bit of customization for each character, and each character can also have 2 different weapons that they can use, and this helps you determine which kinds of fairies you might want to equip them with. So a character will always start with one specific weapon, but eventually their main fairy can also be, you can spend like 250 skill points basically to unlock a secondary weapon. So you gotta use that to inform what you actually want to equip them with, right? If you've got a character that can use a bow and a scythe, then you obviously don't want to equip them with a fairy that mostly gives sword skills, because they won't be able to actually use any of those. Also, sub-fairies are kind of like the game's way of rewarding you for tough battles and things. You'll tend to find that a lot of the ways that you'll gain new sub-fairies are through more difficult battles and or finding them in kind of out-of-the-way locations on the shaper, which we'll talk about in a minute. There's this thing called location shaping that works kind of oddly, but one of the headlining features for the game are the muses. So you have a muse in your party that can sing, and she has all sorts of different songs that she can sing, which will create a big field on the battlefield, and anyone that's within those bounds will receive whatever bonus the song gives. And she can sing for several turns in a row, and then once she runs out of singing juice, you can just sort of recharge it after a couple turns and then start a new song if you want, or you can indeed end the current song early so you don't lose as much juice and you can recharge it faster. But these songs are a big feature of the gameplay because they're really huge buffs, like they're big party-wide bonuses. The one you start out with is a physical attack bonus that just by default will increase everyone's physical attack by 20%, and 20% is a pretty big number because the stats in this game do go relatively high, so that's definitely a significant benefit to your characters, and it reaches for quite a ways. Every song has a different shape to it that it affects, and for instance, the physical defense song is sort of a narrow, long column that you have to sort of shape more carefully, whereas the physical damage song is like a big radius just around her with the muse at the center. However, the enemy teams also have a muse. There is a muse that you're working against, and she has her own songs with their own shapes and their own bonuses, usually the same ones that you have. And she can sing too, so you've got to be careful because the power of these buffs does apply to the enemies as well. Her versions of the song are just as strong as yours. However, there's this thing that happens when the song radii interact, and it's called dramatic resonance. You will be able to see it on the battlefield by these sort of glowing blue squares, and these are where the area of your muse's song and the area of the enemy muse's song intersect. And in these areas, you get a massively increased version of the song's benefits if you stand in those specific spots. So for instance, the 20% physical damage increase becomes a 60% physical damage increase if you're standing in the resonance spots. Or the defensive bonus goes up to like 120% or something like that. So you can drastically improve the effects of these songs, but the enemy also gets the improved effects of their songs if they're standing in the resonance spots as well. So you do have to be a bit careful because standing in these spots will make your party a lot stronger, but you'll also be facing enemies that are a lot stronger too. The muse, every time their turn comes up while they're singing, they can also extend the range of the song they're currently singing, as well as intensify its effects, make it stronger, but they can only do one every turn, so you have to choose which one to increment, and they do stack on each other multiple times. You also have this avalanche gauge you'll see, and when this fills up, you can use it to trigger a radius around the currently selected character, and every friendly person within that radius will help with the attack on every enemy within that radius, so it's like a team attack, basically. And the radius is relatively small, so you've got to position your characters near each other to get the best benefit from it, but it does do a lot of damage to all of the enemies in the radius, and also it gives everyone a bunch of experience that contributes to it, which is useful. But if you use this avalanche gauge during a song, it instead becomes a drastically boosted version that does a lot more damage than the normal avalanche attack does, and it extends its range, that it gathers your friends and attacks enemies by the range of the song itself. So instead of being based around the character you're controlling, it's the whole area that the whole song is currently benefiting. Your individual characters also have a fair eyes gauge, that sort of purple gauge next to their portrait, and this fills up just from them doing things in general, just, taking their turns. Once it's full, you can fair eyes them, which looks quite painful, but basically turns them into like a common rider character and makes them really strong. It basically gives an across-the-board boost to all of their stats, making them super powerful for several turns, and it also allows you to use these special skills that you can unlock later on that are basically like limit breaks that you can only use while fair eyes. They're very powerful but very expensive skills to cast, and they actually don't end the fair eyes when you use them, by the way. You can keep using it afterwards, and you even use the skill multiple times if you have enough SP for it. SP is a very important resource in this game because it's your MP, it's what you use for skills and magic, and it doesn't recharge on its own normally, so you have to be careful about how much you're using because you do want all the damage output, which we'll get into in a little while, but you can only use restorative items a certain number of times per battle, so you can't just like spam ethers to gain all of your SP back constantly. Every character has a limit as to how many items they can use each battle, and that's another one of the passive benefits that leveling up fairies can give you, is more item usages. So there's also that location shaping thing that I mentioned, and what this is on the world map you'll be able to enter this menu called location shaping, where you basically slam a sword into the ground and get some loot because of it. And you get a sort of grid that is over your currently explored areas of the world map, and you can just shove a sword wherever you want, and you'll get some bonuses where you target as well as around that area that you target. You have to choose a fairy, and the fairy mostly determines the chance of getting a free go at it, or the chance of sort of resonating with the elements if they're the same, to increase your chain chances. Basically, it's like a method of getting resources and loot, and you just sort of randomly pick just different squares and see what you find. It's almost like a scratch-off ticket, but in the form of shoving a sword in the ground. It's actually the most reliable way to get resources for the crafting system, because you will find crafting synthesis recipes for side quests and main quests and all sorts of things of that nature, so you'll be able to craft all kinds of stuff, and the main way to get resources for that is to use the location shaping. You'll also find some gear sometimes as a reward, and you can even find fairies as well as new dungeons, dungeons that you can only find by doing this. So it is worth doing as often as possible because the rewards tend to be pretty good, but you do have a limit. You have 5 uses of this that you can do at any given time, and if you get a chain, then you get a free use every time it chains, but eventually you will run out of uses, and every time you complete a mission you will recharge 2 of those uses. So it is something that you can do pretty often. But my main issue here really is that the game presents itself pretty well. The story is serviceable, the characters are sometimes funny, other times annoying, but still, you know, personal preference. But the one thing is, there's not a lot of S in this SRPG. You know, the strategy part, the tactics, there's actually not a whole lot of it. It looks like there is at first because of the large number of spells and skills that every character can have, and the fact that you can customize them a lot in terms of what they're equipped with, and what fairies they're using, and what skills those fairies give them, and all that stuff. You have a lot of control over what things your characters can do in battle. However, the issue is there's basically a predominant strategy. There's a one strategy thing that kind of dominates the gameplay, which is the divide and conquer approach. And the main reason for this is because you are constantly outnumbered. Since you can only field 6 people each battle, you'll usually go up against like a dozen plus enemies every battle, sometimes a lot more than that. And what this basically boils down to is you need to divide into 2 groups of 3 or 3 groups of 2 usually is how you do it, and just use your most powerful skills, just whatever they are. It doesn't really matter what skills every character is equipped with, as long as they have something that does a lot of damage, because damage is the thing. Damage is the one thing that you need, because you just have to rush down as many of the enemies as you can as quickly as possible so that you don't get overwhelmed. And that is because of how outnumbered you are, and because the areas are pretty simple squares. This means that the predominant strategy is that one thing, just DPS, burst damage, kill everything as fast as possible. That's basically all you have to do to win. Now, this is the case for about 90% of the battles. However, there are those 10%, those other battles, where the game shows some brilliance. Like, there's one battle in a desert where you have some dangerous big robotic units and a big dragon in the back, and for this battle you actually have to be careful and use some tactics, because if you just let the dragon get to your party, you'll die, because it's just too strong compared to your whole party. If you have to face all the archers and all the worms that can paralyze you, and all the robots and the dragon all at once, you're totally screwed. And you have to actually use the elevation differences to sort of bait the archers into a corner, and then make sure to use your positioning of your other party members to block the dragon's path with the big robot, so that you don't have to face it along with everything else, and you can save it for last. And you just have to be actually careful and, you know, use some strategy in that battle, and it's a really good battle as a result. It's a very fun map to actually go through, but unfortunately, like 90% of the battles don't use the terrain and strategy to that level of competency. Most of the time, it's just burst damage and you win. So I think that's kind of unfortunate, because it kind of downplays the whole tactics of the tactics RPG to not really have to use much strategy, and for the main goal to always be just damage everything as much as possible, as quick as possible, and that's it. This is not helped by the fact that for some reason they decided to make the muses some of the tankiest characters on the battlefield. You would normally expect a full support class to be very squishy and to need to be protected by tanks to survive, but no, the muses are some of the tankiest characters on any battle. They have a lot of health and they have a lot of natural defense. They can like face tank damage like no one else, and they don't care. It takes like a very sustained assault to actually bring them down. So the idea that maybe you have a strategy choice between allowing the enemy muse to use her song, because you can use your song and create that resonance and make everyone more powerful, or you could choose to rush down the muse and not let her actually buff the party instead, but you don't really have that choice. The choice is kind of made for you, because the muses are so insanely tanky that you basically have to save her for last whenever she shows up, because if you try to rush her down, you basically have to surround her with all of your other party members and just like wail on her for a while, and the whole time you're doing that, you're going to be surrounded by all the other enemies because you're drastically outnumbered and you'll lose. So this means that, like I said, again, it just boils down to burst damage. So overall, I have actually enjoyed my time with the game, but it is definitely a strategy RPG for people that aren't really interested in a lot of strategy, if that makes sense. It's a pretty good entry in the genre, but it also doesn't have a tremendous amount of depth to it. So if you're looking for a more shallow experience, a more casual kind of strategy RPG that doesn't require too much tactical thinking, you know, you're not talking about like Final Fantasy Tactics here, you're talking something a little easier than that, then it does fill that role pretty well and is actually a competent and pretty well-made sort of indie strategy RPG that does a good job. It's just, don't go into it expecting like extremely in-depth characters or extremely in-depth combat. Pretty much everything it does has a bit of a surface level depth to it. So if you're okay with that, then check it out in the link in the description below this video. That will take you to the Steam store page for the game. And thank you guys very much for watching. I'll see you next time.